Discover Geography, Lesson 5-2, Vulnerability. Many of the claims about environmental injustice that we've looked at involved asserting that a certain group of people was being treated unfairly as compared to other groups of people. So in order to understand these types of claims of environmental injustice, we have to investigate the concept of identity. Identity is the answers you'd give to questions like, who am I? What kind of person am I? How do I fit in with the other kinds of people out there? So if I were to answer some of these questions, I might say things like, I'm a college professor, I'm a Pennsylvanian, I'm a science fiction fan, I'm a vegetarian. I might also say things like, I'm white, I'm male, I'm heterosexual. Some of these types of answers to these identity questions constitute the person's position on various axes of inequality. An axis of inequality is an aspect of someone's identity by which society distinguishes people, with some of those people having worse opportunities or treatment than others. The term axis of inequality is a metaphor comparing these types of social categorizations with mathematical axes. In your math classes, you've had to graph things on an XY chart, and every point has an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, possibly a Z coordinate if you're doing a three-dimensional type of mathematical graph. And so just like any point can be given its location in space by these X, Y, and Z coordinates, a person can be given their position in the metaphorical social space by their position on a variety of axes of inequality. So these axes of inequality are things like race, gender, wealth or poverty, sexual orientation, religion, disability or ability, age, nationality, and a whole bunch more. Which axes of inequality are important is going to depend on the type of society that you're dealing with. The axes that I've listed there are some of the more important ones in contemporary US culture. But in other cultural settings, we might see different axes becoming important. As we'll see when we start to discuss race in a later lesson, while race is an incredibly important axis of inequality in our society, it shapes people's opportunities in life to a very great degree. There have been other societies in which race was not recognized as a thing. Neither race nor the characteristics that we associate with race, like skin color, were major characteristics on which people were differentiated and on which people had access to better or worse opportunities in other social situations. On the other hand, there are some axes of inequality that are very important in other societies that make little difference in contemporary US society. If we take caste, for example, caste is a system of hereditary occupational categories in India. Caste is extremely important in India today. Even though caste discrimination has been outlawed in the Indian constitution, people still organize their lives around caste. They still make decisions about things like who to marry based on their caste and the prospective partner's caste. Whereas in the contemporary United States, the vast majority of people don't even have a caste, much less have that caste affect how their lives are going. Now, these various axes of inequality, just like our mathematical axes, intersect with each other. Everyone has a position on all of the different axes of inequality. And this leads us to a concept called intersectionality. Intersectionality refers to the way that these different axes of inequality interact with each other. And so what you see on the slide here is a oversimplified intersection of two axes. You see we've got the axis of race going left to right and the axis of gender going top to bottom. And the four individuals I've put on here to represent four positions on these two axes are all academic researchers who've done work on these types of issues. And in fact, Kimberly Crenshaw, who you see in the upper left there, was actually the person who coined the term intersectionality. So intersectionality refers to the idea that how you're affected by one axis of inequality is going to depend in part on where you stand on other axes of inequality. So in this example, how gender affects you is going to depend in part on your race, and how race affects you is going to depend in part on your gender. So let me give you an example. We know that gender is an important axis of inequality in our society, that overall women have worse opportunities, face more barriers in life than do similarly situated men. And one of the major ways that this kind of sexism operates in our society is that women's value is highly tied up in their sexual attractiveness, that it becomes very important to a woman's life whether she's viewed by others as sexually attractive. That becomes the most important thing about her to other people in many contexts. Now, the standards by which we judge someone's sexual attractiveness are not race neutral. They tend to emphasize features that are more typical of white people. So lighter skin is typically considered more attractive. Straight hair is considered more attractive than really tightly curled hair, etc. So what that means is that while black women and white women are both going to be judged heavily on the basis of their sexual attractiveness, this is going to operate in a somewhat different way for them. That white women can more easily meet this beauty standard, and so therefore they often have an experience in which their other good qualities, their intelligence, their drive and ambition, etc., are all discounted because all people really care about is their attractiveness. And so they find themselves objectified and treated as someone whose main value is to be a pretty face to look at. On the other hand, black women often find that because they're not able to meet these standards, because they're not able to have the light skin that's considered beautiful in our society, they find that their entire value ends up being dismissed. If they can't be hot, well then they have no value because of the way sexism operates in our society. So we have the same sexism that's affecting women of different races, and yet it affects them in different ways because of their race. And we could complicate this analysis even further by putting in other axes of inequality. So all of these things are going to affect disabled women differently than able-bodied women. They're going to affect poor women differently than rich women. They're going to affect straight women and lesbians differently, etc. So we always want to keep in mind that we can never analyze any one axis of inequality in total isolation from all of the others, because how one axis is going to affect people is going to depend in part on where they stand on all of the other axes that are important in their society. One of the major ways that axes of inequality are perpetuated in a society is through the construction of unmarked norms. An unmarked norm occurs when the characteristics of one group, the dominant or better off group on a particular axis, are treated as normal or default or unremarkable, whereas the characteristics of people on the other end of this particular axis are treated as being unusual, an exception to the rule, some sort of deviation. And so we can see that illustrated in the upper pair of bathroom signs that we see here. These are the standard bathroom signs that we see all over the place, marking out the men's room and the women's room. And what we see is the male figure is the unmarked figure. It's just a plain stick figure. It's something that could be used to represent people in general. It's the same kind of stick figure that you see in a walk sign at a crosswalk, for example. It's not meant to say men can walk, it's meant to say people can walk. And yet that same unadorned stick figure represents the men's room, whereas the stick figure that's had embellishments added to it, that has the dress on it, becomes the symbol for the women's room, implying that women are sort of an exception, that they are a deviation from the standard human figure. You can see in the lower picture an example of bathroom signs that don't treat men as the unmarked norm. Here you see both signs involve a circle for a face and then a bow as an item of clothing. One has the bow on top to represent a hair bow, so therefore the women's room, one with the bow below representing a bow tie, therefore the men's room. Another example of an unmarked norm came up in the context of a little controversy that occurred over a dress that Michelle Obama wore to a state function a few years back. A number of news outlets described her dress as being either flesh-colored or nude. And these are standard terms in the fashion world. They refer to a specific color that is, in fact, the color of her dress. And yet when we think about where those terms come from, why is it that we call color flesh or nude. It's obviously not the color of Michelle Obama's flesh. Her flesh is much darker than that. It's obviously not the color that Michelle Obama is when she's nude. And yet these words were used to describe that dress. Now that dress is the color of, for example, my flesh. You see my hand in the picture there. It's very similar in color to that dress. That dress is the color of white people's flesh. So white people get to have flesh-colored flesh because white bodies are the unmarked norm. They're treated as a standard normal type of human. And then people of color, people whose bodies are different, are seen as some sort of an exception to that rule, some sort of an anomaly, people whose flesh is not flesh-colored. Now you can see the jacket that I'm wearing there in that picture, and it's not a great picture, so the color balance is a little off, but in real life that jacket is actually quite similar to the color of Michelle Obama's flesh. And yet no one would ever say that I was wearing a flesh-colored jacket when I was wearing that jacket. And so this may seem like a little thing, a little bit of fashion terminology, but this is just one of many ways in which, on this particular axis of inequality, axis of race, people on one end are treated as normal and therefore get more advantage within society, whereas people on the other end of that axis are treated as a sort of a deviation or an exception to the rule and therefore face more obstacles within society. Now let's bring this all back into the issue of the environment. We're going to look in this case at the question of vulnerability to natural disasters and natural hazards. It's a common saying among geographers and other people that study these kinds of issues that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Now what we mean by that is not that things like earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes don't occur, nor do we mean that those types of events are somehow entirely produced by people. And yet, when we look at these so-called natural disasters, we find that the impact that they have, the amount of disaster that's caused by an event like an earthquake or a hurricane, is not necessarily closely connected to the natural magnitude of this event. So you see there pictures of the aftermath of two different earthquakes that happened within a few months of each other. The top picture shows an earthquake in Haiti that was a 7.0 on the moment magnitude scale. The moment magnitude scale is kind of a revised version of the Richter scale that you may have heard of. It's a scale that measures the amount of shaking that goes on in an earthquake. And so this 7.0 magnitude earthquake killed 230,000 people in Haiti. It was devastating to this country. Years later, Haiti is still recovering from the effects of this earthquake. A few months later, an earthquake hit the country of Chile. The earthquake in Chile was far more powerful in terms of the amount of shaking of the earth than the earthquake that hit Haiti. The Chile earthquake was an 8.8 magnitude. And the moment magnitude scale is a logarithmic scale. So an 8.8 magnitude earthquake is hundreds of times stronger than a 7.0 magnitude earthquake. And yet in Chile, only 531 people were killed. You can see that building, the windows are cracked, but it's still basically standing. So there's something more than just the natural event going on here. The scale of the disaster is not purely a function of the scale of the natural event, the amount of shaking from the earthquake. What's causing the difference here? What's shaping the magnitude of the disaster that's experienced in the aftermath of an earthquake is the organization of the human societies that are being hit by the earthquake. Haiti was a society that was not able to cope well with an earthquake, and so a smaller magnitude earthquake devastated it, whereas Chile was more able to cope with the earthquake, and so therefore an even stronger earthquake did less damage in Chile. We can describe these ideas through a pair of conceptual equations. So these are conceptual equations. They describe the different factors going together, but they're not things that we would ever really bother to put numbers into and calculate out. They're just a way of representing these ideas in a kind of mathematical notation. So the first equation says that risk, the amount of danger that's posed by some sort of natural event, is a function of the hazard. This is the natural event. This is the earthquake, the tornado, the hurricane, the forest fire, or whatever other event we're dealing with. times the vulnerability. The vulnerability is the social side of the equation. Vulnerability is how human societies make themselves susceptible to being hurt by this hazard event. So if your society is not vulnerable to a particular hazard event, if that hazard event is unable to hurt it, then it doesn't matter how big the hazard is, you're going to have very little risk. On the other hand, if you have a society that's incredibly vulnerable to a certain type of hazard, then even a small hazard can create a huge risk, can create a huge disaster once it hits. We can take vulnerability and break it down into three components that make it up. So in the lower equation, you see that vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure means who is in the path of this hazard event, who is located on the places that this hazard event is going to hit hard, and who is located somewhere where they're going to be sheltered from it. Sensitivity is a measurement of once the hazard hits, once you are exposed to it, how much damage is it going to do? If you're going to get a certain amount of wind happening in a storm, you're going to get a certain amount of shaking in an earthquake, how much damage is that actually going to do? Is it going to wreck everyone's house down, or is it just going to knock some pictures off the wall? Those are different levels of sensitivity to the same event. And finally, adaptive capacity refers to the ability of that society to rebuild afterward, to bounce back from the hazard. So a hazard might hit really hard, might destroy a lot of stuff, and yet if the society can easily rebuild from it, they have a high level of adaptive capacity, then their vulnerability is going to be lower. They've been able to weather that hazard and get back on their feet. On the other hand, if your adaptive capacity is very low, then you will sustain some damage and not be able to recover from it. And so that would indicate that your vulnerability, the amount that you are going to suffer from this hazard, is going to be much higher. Now we can put this all together by asking who is going to be more vulnerable to a given hazard event. When a hazard hits, and you see in the picture here the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, some people are going to be very vulnerable to that hazard. Some people are going to be devastated by it. Other people are not going to be hurt very badly by it. And these differences in vulnerability often fall along our axes of inequality. This is one way in which people on one end of an axis of inequality may end up having worse opportunities in life, is because they're made more vulnerable to natural hazards that may come along. And then that vulnerability and the suffering that they experience from those natural hazards may perpetuate the inequality. The lingering effects of the devastation they suffered will continue to create this sort of inequality. So let's take the example of Hurricane Katrina and ask who might have been more vulnerable to this particular event. And we can go step by step through that vulnerability equation. So if we start with exposure, who's more exposed to the damage from a hurricane? Much of the damage from Hurricane Katrina actually occurred because of the flooding, not just because of the high winds when the hurricane was actually blowing. So who's more exposed to that flooding? Well, within New Orleans, black residents tended to live in low-lying, easily flooded areas, where white residents tended to live on the higher ground and behind the better-built levees. And so black residents were more exposed to the flooding. The flooding was more likely to hit them than it was to hit the white residents of New Orleans. If we look at sensitivity, once you get hit by the flood, who's going to suffer more from it? Well, in this case, we can see a clear difference in vulnerability based on age. Older residents of New Orleans had more health conditions that would make it harder for them to cope with the flooding and evacuation after the flooding. A young, able-bodied person could deal with that flooding, could get out of their home, could save some of their possessions, could find a way to get something to eat, and could get to safety much more easily than an older resident. And so therefore, the older residents were more vulnerable in terms of sensitivity. Then if we look at adaptive capacity, who can rebuild more easily after the devastation? Well, here, economic wealth is going to be a big issue. Who's going to have the money to rebuild their house once it's been damaged by the floodwater. So of course, poor residents of New Orleans had more difficulty rebuilding. They didn't have the savings to rebuild their houses. They didn't have a continuing source of income once they were driven out of the city and the places where they worked got flooded. They didn't have as good or sometimes any insurance that would cover flood damage. And so they have much more trouble rebuilding, getting back on their feet, putting their life back together after the hurricane. And so we see this over and over again. With any natural disaster we look at, we see differences in vulnerability, and those differences tend to fall along our axes of inequality. That people of color will be more vulnerable than white people. That women will be more vulnerable than men. That poor people will be more vulnerable than rich people. And so vulnerability to natural hazards then potentially constitutes a form of environmental injustice. If we consider that it's unfair that certain groups are more vulnerable to the same hazard events than others.